Okay, marvellous. Well, as Celia said, as people were coming in, this is an extremely timely meeting, given that 40,000 railway workers were on strike yesterday, are on strike tomorrow, on strike Saturday, and have already created a massive, massive political impact on society. All the news endlessly talking about the strike. The General Secretary is all over the media at the minute, and it's created a whole discussion, probably in every workplace, where people are talking about the rail workers and about pay. Now, you know, most of us were already talking about the cost of living and pay, but it's created a different discussion. The other thing to add to that is, of course, the TUC demonstration on Saturday. For anybody that was or wasn't there, I thought something was different. I've been on, you know, enough demonstrations in my life and enough big demonstrations in my life, but actually there was a new mood. You know, it's an old term in the SWP, but there was a mood there. And on my PCS coach from Birmingham, lots and lots of people who'd never been on a demonstration before, lots of people who are reps in my branch who've never been on a demonstration before. There was a real feeling that there's the beginnings of a resistance. And it isn't just the RMT that have started taking action now. The CWU, the Communication Workers Union, are in dispute on the telecom side and have just announced and just started a ballot on the postal side, which again will have a significant impact politically as well as economically on British politics. I've seen something that Kevin Courtney of the NEU posted today about fall in pay in the teaching profession. We know that they're taking very seriously how they get to a pay ballot. And in the PCS, we at conference last month agreed that we would go for a strike ballot in September. It's looking like a serious upswing of resistance in our class. And it's got to be said, it's been a long time coming, and it's a very, very welcome development. Let me just show you, I'm not going to keep going in and out of things, but I do want to show two images during this discussion. I'm not going to spend time on it. Martin, can you see that? Yeah. I want to just go quickly over this. So this is the strike days between 1948 and 2018. There's three peaks here. I'm not going to labour it. This one here is 1972. And nearly 25 million strike days in 1972. And it's more significant in many ways than the two higher ones, which I'll talk about later. But this is what I wanted to really draw attention to. This is the last 30 years. In the last 30 years, we've had less than 1.5 million strike days, so-called lost, every year. The last time there was more than 1.5 million was in 1989, and there was a national rail strike. So it's really disturbing when you see that long tail of very low level of struggle. Right, I don't want to stare at that any longer, because those 30 years, many of us here have experienced and witnessed and despaired over, but actually it does feel like there is something changing. And I will come back to 1972 in a bit. A couple of notes first. In terms of statistics, those of us who are nerdy and like these things, it's never very accurate. So there's always underreporting of strike figures because they don't count all sorts of things. Socialist Worker reported that actually you will never know the official figures for 2020 and 2021 because the ONS, yeah, it's amazing how you lose the names. Crucial moments. The National Statistics Body has decided that it's never going to try and track them down. And the only way you'll ever know, and there's a very good article in Socialist Worker, is by looking back through things like Socialist Worker. The other thing is some of the things that made political history in the last couple of years weren't strikes. So the teachers refusing to go to work made a massive difference to government policy. 400,000 teachers joined a mass Zoom meeting. It will never be forgotten, but it will never figure in industrial action figures. So it's always important to see some of these things in context. But something is stirring and something has been stirring. If you watch the BBC, you would never know. If you read Socialist Worker, you will know. But there is something happening. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes just talking about it. I'm not going to spend too much time. In the colleges, the Lecturers Union, the UCU, both in FE and in HE, have seen significant strikes. And it isn't just classic one-day strikes. In the civil service, we have a history, certainly not a recent one, but a history of one-day strikes, and the class has a history of one-day strikes in the public sector. Actually, the issue strikes have seen long strikes, they've seen increasing days of strike action and very dynamic action. On the bins, there have been a number of disputes. In this city, in Birmingham, there was a bins dispute, which was long and bitter and won. There have been bin strikes across the country, and there's the beginnings of reports of coordination between bin workers across the country, which is an exceptionally important development. There have been amazing cleaners strikes. In the civil service, in Bays, in London, there was a really dynamic strike. You know, you watch the pictures every day, there's dancing, there's singing, it's vibrant, and it's a long battle, and it's a one battle. And lots of cleaners disputes, often organised by quite new unions, not with decades and centuries of history, but with an expectation that they're there to fight. And the disputes that have been won. In the Facebook advert for this meeting, you talk about how the GMB has been involved in 42 disputes. I don't think it's a secret to say the GMB does not have the sort of record that people go around going, wow, the GMB, it's not the NUM in terms of history, but actually in recent history, but actually something has begun to change. And Unite are reporting 4 times higher levels of strikes than a few years ago. This is something that's different. As I say, it's not like you can just look on the media and every day there are strikes. It isn't that coverage, but there is something changing, and it starts to seep into the consciousness of activists and people beyond the activists, and that's really extremely, extremely important. And no wonder at the moment in this year that this is starting to happen. I'm going to show one more set of figures. You don't need to see this, you're all living it, but just as a reminder, these aren't even the most recent numbers. You just look at the inflation figures over the last 10 years. We've had, in the civil service for 10 years, we've talked about we deserve a pay rise. Actually, what's changed is it's gone from we have this slowly declining relative income, which has been very real and very problematic, to actually we're just being left behind in a massive way. And it's not obviously just civil services across the board. The reports now of over 11% inflation isn't just a number. When you talk about inflation's going up and it's gone from 1 to 1.5, it used to be a number, it used to be a discussion point that the left would make, but actually now people are feeling and suffering on an incredible level, as I know people are doing themselves. So when you look at the increasing numbers of strikes, it can feel like we're on the up and up and it's inevitable. And I think we have to be careful not to think that it's inevitable that we'll get more strikes and it's inevitable that we'll win those strikes. There's a long way to go. And Tony Cliff, the founder of the SWP, talked about the working class movement as being a patient in hospital. And he said, the first time you get out of bed after a long time if you've been sick, actually you can't just get up and run around. And it can take some time. And it's a useful analogy. It's dangerous and it's useful. It's useful because we have to recognise there can be setbacks along the road. But we also have to say, what are the possibilities that actually we move forward significantly and rapidly as a class? And sometimes people on the left have a very linear trajectory. We got 1 million strikes this year, we'll get 2 million next year and 3 million. And somewhere down the line, we'll have a general strike. Actually, isn't the way that history moves. History moves in a much more fluid and much more dynamic manner. And so we'll talk a little bit about the 1970s. I've told Celia to shut up if I go on for too long about this. It was an amazing piece of our history. But actually, when you look at what happened between the 60s and the 70s, from the early 60s to the early 70s, there was an increasing level of struggle. And again, you wouldn't know it if you were reading the mainstream media, but Socialist Worker and the papers that preceded it in our tradition were always tracking these things. And some very important publications were produced by our organisation as a part of trying to cohere an understanding amongst activists inside the trade unions about what was happening and what was possible. But the key year in all of this really is 1972. At the beginning of 1972, the miners voted to strike over pay. And when you look back, and I know some of you, are old enough to have experienced it, right? And I was 7, so I'm not one of them. But when you look back over it, it can look like it was always great and it was a fantastic period. When you read about it, though, this is the editor of the Daily Mirror on the 9th of January, just as the strike started, 1972. They have more stacked against them than the Light Brigade in their famous charge. It wasn't inevitable that the miners were going to win at all. The last time the miners had been on strike, on a national strike, was 1926. And that was an incredibly important moment, but not one that went down to victory. So it wasn't inevitable the miners were going to win, but actually from day one, because something had been changing in the class, from day one, the railway workers refused to move coal. The truckers in the unions refused to move coal. The dockers refused to unload coal. And so very rapidly, what should have been a quick, short, sharp defeat for miners in the eyes of the government and the employers became an offensive attack by the miners. And again, without spending time on it, the solidarity was incredible. One of the things I think that's really quite exciting about it was they would picket a workplace, they would win an agreement over what was and wasn't allowed to be done in terms of what coal they could use. You know, they accepted that coal could be allowed for hospitals, coal for schools, coal for housing, but not for factories. So, and they worked their way around the country, picketing places, and they came up with a permit system. Now, you know, I'm not going to go into other periods in history, but essentially it was a little bit like dual power. So the miners said, you can have 5 tons of coal a week, and there's the permit, and any more, and there'll be trouble. And then they'd leave a token picket or no picket at all, and they would move on to picket somewhere else, rapidly covering the most important moment in that strike in some ways, which was Saltley Gate in Birmingham. For 10 days, they tried to picket Saltley. Saltley was a coking works that was breaking the rules. You know, the miners were imposing a way of doing business, and Saltley was trying to break it. And the government was very enthusiastic. The Tory government was enthusiastic about the prospect of using this as a moment to turn the strike. So more and more and more miners started to turn up in Birmingham. Arthur Scargill, the leader of the Yorkshire miners at the time, he turns up, he brings 2,000 miners, and they just cannot close Saltley. They can't stop them breaking through. Arthur goes to speak to the AEU. He goes to speak to a number of unions, which are all now part of Unite. And he says, we don't want your money. We want your bodies. We want you on strike. He goes to see those meetings. They all commit to it. 2 days later, 30,000 workers are on strike, and they march. So in the east of Birmingham, it's a very industrial area at the time. They strike in support of the miners, and then thousands and thousands of them then march down to Saltley. And maybe I will dig out the picture for later, but they march down and they shut Saltley Gate. And when I read about this, and for the first time a long time ago, it was very, very exciting. And I imagined this gate, there's this big thing, you know, like a castle, big, boom. And that gate was shut, boom. Actually, it's this really ratchetty little thing. I will dig it out before the end of the meeting. And it doesn't look significant. It was significant because they'd stopped a scabbing operation. And it turned the tide completely. And within a few weeks, the miners had won. The miners winning that strike in 72 opened the floodgates. Dockers were on strike soon afterwards. Lost the point of my notes where I was, naturally. Builders had a national strike. Very, very important strike swept across the country through 1972. To the point where the Home Secretary, Reginald Maudlin, said at the end of the strike, we were wandering across the battlefield looking for someone to surrender to. And, you know, I possess his memoirs. I don't have many of such people's books, but I do have his memoirs, and that was the main reason, just to possess that line and being able to find it and quote it. And incredibly important. Why it's important for us to talk about it is because strikes don't just, as I said, it's not a linear process. Suddenly, the strikes can explode. The class struggle can explode, and people learn from each other and change their expectations. Now, we're a long way from that. It's not the case that people are used to strikes. It's not the case that people are used to delivering solidarity. But some groups are. Postal workers don't cross picket lines. So we would expect, you know, when we're on strike, I don't expect them to cross my picket line, and they can expect us to deliver solidarity back to them. There are a couple of things we have to kind of say in this context. The miners won despite a right-wing union leadership, a very right-wing union leadership. They won because of the strength that existed, in particular in Yorkshire, some extent in Wales and Scotland. that actually there was a strength of organisation that meant they could drive through the strike and they could run the strike completely independently of the officialdom. When you look at the situation today, we're quite a long way away from that. And there are two things. One is we've got lots of good left-wing union leaders. Kevin Courtney from the NEU, my General Secretary, Mark Savotka, Sharon Graham from Unite, Mick Lynch at the moment from the RMT, are all people who we find ourselves in alliance with. We want to work with them because we want to deliver strikes. Thank you, Celia. We want to deliver industrial action. We want to deliver power on the side of our class. And long may it remain that we're on the same side. But I think we have to remember at the same time that they come under different pressures, because great as those people are, and I know some of them personally, great as they are not in the workplace. They're removed from the workplace and they can come under different pressures. They can come under the pressure of the government trying to do a deal that seems like it may be the best that we can get if you're sitting in the union's regional office, but not if you're sitting in a workplace. They can come under pressure if the government says, if you do that, we will make it illegal. That's a very important point. We haven't come across for a very long time in this country. But actually, if they say your strike is illegal, what happens then? That was floated around the RMT dispute. It could be floated around any of these disputes. And then suddenly the people in the machine will come under incredible pressure to buckle. And suddenly there'll be much more tension between the rank and file trade union activists and the trade union officers in the General Secretaries and the like. It doesn't mean we don't think their heart's in the right place. It means we recognise they will experience different pressures. We use the word bureaucracy. It's not meant to sound as an insult. It's often used as one. It's actually a way of describing an isolation from daily existence. There's a very good quote that gets quoted a lot in the SWP by the Clyde Workers' Committee in 1919. And they say, we will support the officials so long as they represent the workers, but we will work independently immediately they misrepresent them. And actually, that is one of the many watchwords for the SWP. We want to build alongside trade union officers when we can, because they have an influence we don't have, but actually at times we will find that we cross swords with them in the interests of taking struggle forward. I'll start to wind up. Something's changing. That's the point of this whole discussion, and hopefully there'll be lots of good examples of that when we have the discussion in a minute. For us, it's not about simply enjoying it. It's great. Picket lines are great, isn't it fantastic? Or just analysing it, getting graphs out, happy as that makes me. It's actually about saying we've got a responsibility to help to shape it in our workplaces, in our communities, but in particular in our workplaces, in our trade unions right now. What can we do to build support for the rail workers? What can we do to make sure that we're taking the struggles forward in our own sections? How do we make people feel like they belong to the union and belong to the struggle? There were 3 people from my office on the demonstration. I was a bit disappointed because at one point I thought I was going to have 7. But those 3 people, one of them is me, the other 2 are now walking around going, it was great, it was fucking great, and we did this and we did that. And there's a vibe, and it helps to shape the mood in my office. And we need to be trying to find ways of emulating that everywhere that we can. We have a contingent from the PCS going to the picket lines tomorrow in Birmingham, and that will be about us feeling the experience, bringing the solidarity, but taking it back into our workplaces, taking it back into our unions. And really, that change is important to us, I think. Because whether you've been active, I know some of you and I don't know some of you, whether you've been active as a socialist for 5 minutes or for 5 decades, we have to feel the change, we have to live the change, and we have to help to shape the change. And that's really important, both in the sense of building the struggles, but also in terms of building a socialist current inside the struggles. Because it's not that it's easy to build the struggles, because it's not. But it's also very important to be able to prepare for that moment when we may have to start to disagree with our union officers. And if we don't do both, then we become weakened. Some people only build the socialist current, and all they're really doing is building an isolated sectarian minority. You have to be in the class, you have to be fighting for socialist ideas. So I'll shut up. That's fantastic. Thank you, Celia. Thank you, everybody. That was a really fascinating conversation. And now I'm going to own up to something. Due to childcare, I wasn't on a picket line yesterday. I will be in the morning. And this conversation has really raised my excitement about that and my expectation for just how good it will be. And actually, I think Karen said the effect on our own batteries and our political motivation is extremely important. Sarah and I produced a little flyer that I support the rail workers with PCS on it. It's taken to work. And, the truth is I haven't done it yet. But after I went on a picket line tomorrow, I know that I'll have that little extra. And by the end of the day, I'll have 20 or 30 people having taken a picture with it. And I'll be able to take that back into my bit of the union and into the union generally and argue what we need to do. And the thing that Martin said about young workers, I mean, I learnt my politics on the miners' strike picket lines in South Wales. I suspect Karen did from the look of that response. Lots and lots of people did. And most of us can mark the moments of our political education, not simply in terms of when you read Lenin or Cliff or whatever it might be, important as they were, but actually when you saw the police attacking a picket line, when you witnessed our class fighting, not in the case of the miners, but other times winning. And those are really important. And they are about people understanding class politics, and they are about people understanding the potential for change that can't be done away with in our minds. A couple of other things, though, that are important, because Jean and I think Rahman talked about the P&O, and I didn't, and it's the other side of this, isn't it? In the same year that we're looking at an RMT strike potentially changing the whole political shape of this country and the expectations of millions of workers, you also saw momentarily the prospect of real resistance being completely thrown away, and supposedly we're boycotting P&O. And, that was a terrible defeat for our side. And it is a continual warning that this thing is not a given. There is a balance here, and there's a risk at all times that if our leadership fails, if there isn't enough rank and sharp file leadership that can resist sometimes the full-time officials, we can be in a completely different picture. And I think we have to remember that 72 was a spectacular moment. The miners won in 72 and they won in 74. And in 74, the government went to the polls on the slogan, who runs the country, the unions or the government? And the government lost. And it's a very important moment. But that was followed by a Labour government, and I'm not going to waste time on this, a Labour government that cut working class living standards. It attacked working class people in the interests of the ruling class, and our trade union leaders, the Communist Party, all aligned themselves with that in what was called a social contract. And they collaborated in reducing working class living standards and laying the ground for Thatcher. And that's a really important thing to remember. And that's where the need for independent politics starts to come into its own. It isn't just that it's great that we struggle. The other thing about that, because Adam said, there's a tendency to syndicalism. And I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about our conference that me and Sarah were at, the PCS conference recently. And this is, some of the important things that Celia just said that we bring to the struggle are about how you win. They are. But sometimes there's other people that have got that stuff, and that's great. And sometimes they're better than us about how to win, and that's even better. But actually, the anti-racist stuff, bringing up Rwanda, who did that at our PCS conference? The SWP members through their branches did that. Who took on the nationality bill? It was SWP members through our branches that put that on the agenda of conference and reminded people we have to fight over these political issues as well. The environment, many of the motions started out from us. And although we lost, and badly lost, an argument about the Ukraine war, it was incredibly important that we put an argument that says this, this is an important part of the class struggle. And that argument will come back around. And I think it's really important that we understand one of the differences with the 70s. The 70s was more militant than we are today, but anybody that was around then will tell you the level of politics inside the class was very low. Union branches didn't talk about anti-racism as a rule. They didn't talk about C&D, which was a big nuclear power and stuff, nuclear weapons, which was a big deal as a rule. And in fact, one of my friends who used to work in the Rover plant in the 70s talked about how the National Front had a base. They had an active group and a banner that said National Front inside the Rover plant in Birmingham. And that's something that he was involved in organising to destroy. But actually, politics matters inside the class, because the ability to destabilise us, the ability to disorient our side is out there. The most important political thing I've been doing this week in work, so, not just in terms of raising the strikes, is fighting for Eid. Eid is coming up. It's going to be on a Saturday and it's going to shut my office. And believe it or not, that's an issue. That's an issue in my workplace. And as a white male socialist trade unionist, I'm at the front of going, you will let everybody take Eid and we don't care if it shuts the office. It shouldn't be a big deal, but it is a big deal. And it's a big deal, and those things matter. And those things motivate and inspire people around us to say, I'm proud of my white socialist rep. I got called comrade by someone who I'm sure doesn't really know what I think that means today. And it was a nice little moment. But we have to be thinking about that. That's how I would respond, Adam, to the things about a tendency towards syndicalism. I'm not suggesting that you don't agree with that. But actually, if we don't put politics in the class, politics will come back and it will bloody bite us and bite us hard. So I'm looking forward to the picket line tomorrow. I think there's a lot that needs to be done, and there's a lot that we're doing as socialists. We are an incredibly small minority in the class at the minute. That's something we have to try and change wherever and whenever we can. But actually it starts with celebrating the struggles, doesn't it? Unless we can say, isn't that fantastic? You have to join me, come down to the picket line, feel the struggle with me, then actually it becomes something that's separate and special. I think, we're in a moment. That moment will potentially move forward. It can move back. We have to do everything we can to try and make sure that we move forward and that we understand if it doesn't go the right way. I'm going to shut up.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, I didn't